I'm Rabbi Audrey. I'm Rabbi Audrey Marcus Berkman, Rabbi of Temple Ohabei Shalom, now for over 5 years, in my 6th year now, and it is my honor and pleasure to meet Rabbi Seltzer. We haven't had the pleasure of meeting in person. We've been in touch over email. We hope to meet one of these days, but it is really wonderful to have the miracle um, of Zoom so that we can all be together. I understand there's folks here from not only from Tucson, where Rabbi Seltzer currently lives, but of course from Brookline in our local area, as well as Seattle, and there may well be other states represented. And that is really wonderful. So it is my pleasure to introduce tonight's program. And as many or most of you know, we are celebrating our 180th year as a congregation this year at Temple Ohavei Shalom. And so as we look back at our 18 decades of history, we're of course thinking about our past clergy leaders. And I have heard, and many of you know firsthand, what an excellent and inspiring teacher Rabbi Seltzer is, with what I've heard is many esoteric interests about which he can speak really beautifully. And so no surprise that we have so many people here tonight who clearly all know that about Rabbi Seltzer. And we thought this would be a really wonderful way to have something special in this week leading up to what we're calling our Learning Weekend at the Temple, where we'll hear from other scholars and leaders about various subjects related to history and our history in particular. I do want to let everybody know that those programs will almost entirely be hybrid. So if you are in Seattle or Tucson or wherever else in the world, you are more than welcome to join us for a beautiful, amazing roster of programs this coming Shabbat. Friday night, we actually have our local Congressman Jake Auchincloss speaking, but Saturday we have a number of scholars and others speaking, and so you can check out our website for all of those details. So I think many of you are acquainted with Rabbi Seltzer in one way or another, but what I will tell you, in case you don't know, is that Rabbi Seltzer was the associate rabbi of Temple Ohavei Shalom from 1997 to 2005. And he was involved for many years in the reform movement in various ways. I was very impressed reading over his resume, his CV. He was the director of the Central Conference of American Rabbis Commission on Worship and on Religious Living, and was the director of research. So that's for the CCAR, that's the Reform Rabbinic Association. So many leadership roles there, and has been a leading voice in interreligious dialogue, was the director of the Interreligious Center on Public Life from 1999 to 2010, which was established as a joint venture of Hebrew College and Andover Newton Theological School, so both here local to the Boston area. And it was the only body of its kind under the auspices of both a Protestant seminary and a Jewish institution of higher learning. Rabbi Seltzer has published many journal articles and edited and written several books. A few of them struck me as particularly interesting. A mental health resource and study guide on prayer as a source of psychological growth and well-being, published in 2003 with Richard Address, and Divine Embodiment and the Mysteries of Phylacteries, Fringes and the Rosary, in the Journal of Ecumenical Studies in the spring of 2011. That is really intriguing. Rabbi Seltzer has been vice president of the National Interfaith Coalition on the Aging, served on the board of trustees of Jewish Family and Children's Service of Boston, and was a delegate to the Parliament of World Religions in Melbourne, Australia in 2009. So That's just a brief selection of many, many impressive accomplishments. But I think what we're most intrigued by, at least I am, is how Rabbi Seltzer decided to delve into the history of coffee and the Jews, two of my favorite topics, to be honest. Love coffee, love the Jews, and I can't wait to hear about how those two things intersect. And I'm guessing that you are also really excited to hear. So I'm going to hand it over to Rabbi Seltzer, and I do hope you'll share with us how you decided to research this very important topic.
Well, thank you very much. I'm delighted to be here. I appreciate your very generous introduction, Audrey, and I'm looking forward to an opportunity for us to get together. I have to tell you that while it's nearly 20 years since I served at Ohabei Shalom, it brings back many, many memories, very meaningful memories. First of all, I want to say hello again. Is Sherry on, Sherry Sherwin? Well,
I don't see her right now, but we will pass
well, I
along
want
the
to say
message.
hello to Sherry, who currently serves as the executive director of the congregation, because it was due to her and also Larry Green. I did see Larry earlier, did I not? Larry, correct me if I'm wrong, Rabbi Berkman.
I am here. Good to see you, Rabbi. I'm here.
Is the chair of the planning committee for this 180th anniversary of the founding of TOS, Temple Ohabei Shalom. And so I'm grateful to both of them, in addition to you, Audrey, for giving me this particular opportunity. My one regret is that I will not be present when all of this occurs, starting this coming Shabbat. And then, of course, as I read the brochure itself throughout this year in 2023. I have some memories, you'll forgive me, because I want to mention one rabbi who served this congregation perhaps longer than any other, and I'm referring to the late Albert Goldstein. Albert Goldstein, some of the older members of the congregation who may be watching or listening, Albert was flamboyant. He was admittedly controversial. He was also brilliant. And he could cite a verse from Keats or Lord Byron with the same facility as he could recite a Talmudic passage from Rabbi Akiva or Hillel. And I noticed that the idea to found this congregation occurred in 1842 on Rosh Hashanah. Well, you know, Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur actually is only 3 weeks ago. It's hard to believe. It's only 3 weeks ago. And what I will never forget, and some of you on this evening may well remember, on Kol Nidre night, when Albert Goldstein, of blessed memory, was still alive, he was invited to come to the Bima and to recite the closing Kaddish, which began, birth is a beginning, and death a destination, and life is a journey. You still recited, Rabbi Berkman, I'm sure that you do, but when Albert recited it, it was real. He encompassed what it meant. And Zita Samuels, yes, she remembers. Others may recall it as well. I also want to say, especially to those of you who are watching this, who live in Tucson and other parts of the country other than Brookline or Greater Boston. The sanctuary of Ohabei Shalom is magnificent. It is magnificent. And when one stands on the Bima, as I did for any number of years, and is called upon to read the service, to give a sermon, there is an element of inspiration. There is a dimension of excitement that I would say, speaking very selfishly and personally, is overwhelming. Now, when I decided to talk about coffee, I was also tempted to email Howard Schultz in Seattle, Washington, because, I think he is the primary stockholder, if not the chief executive officer of Starbucks. And I don't know whether he's Jewish, and I don't know whether he's well aware of the fact that there's a long history of Jewish involvement, both in the trade of coffee, in Jewish coffee houses, etc. And I would bet you, and I don't know, in 1842, when the founders of Ohabei Shalom were meeting to determine whether they were going to create this new entity, I would be surprised if they didn't have coffee. It would also not surprise me if they would have met in any number of the coffee houses that were at that time open in the city of Boston. Why Boston in particular? Well, if you know anything about American history, then you know that in what was the precise date? 1773, the good citizens of Boston, angry over the fact that the British government of King George in London, without consulting them, and they were loyal citizens of the British Empire, had imposed a tax on tea. Remember when you studied this in college, the Boston Tea Party? And so on a given day, what did they do? A group of patriots dumped a ton of tea into Boston Harbor. And rather than drink the tea of England, instead, coffee became a very prominent beverage to replace it. So therefore, there were coffee houses such as the Green Dragon, among others, and coffee may have been the beverage that the founders of Ohabei Shalom decided to drink, 180 years ago. And by the way, another reason I was intrigued by talking about coffee is that during the early years of what became the state of Israel, and even thereafter, coffee was deemed to be exceedingly important. And I'll give you a couple of examples. In 1934, a Hebrew poet in Tel Aviv, speaking about Tel Aviv per se, a man named Avraham Shlonsky writes the following: "Blessed are you, Tel Aviv. Everywhere you turn around, coffee houses call you, and they say," and then he puts it in the Hebrew, "Bo hena," come here. Even earlier, in 1926, in what was still then British-occupied Palestine, another author, a Hebrew author named Shimon Halkin, talks about a cafe. Look at the word cafe, look at the word coffee, and look at the Hebrew word for coffee, which is cafe. And he says, when you go into a cafe in Tel Aviv, it's a modern Jewish temple. How and why is it a modern Jewish temple? Well, he talks about the cigarette smoke and the steam of the coffee, which become the equivalent, first of the temple, the Beit HaMikdash. Why? Because the steam and the smoke are reminiscent of the incense, if you will, that was burned when the temples stood. And it's also a reminiscent of the house of study. Why is it reminiscent of the Beit Midrash, the synagogue house of study? For the simple reason that when you went to a coffee house, what did you do? You engaged in all kinds of intellectual pursuits. And therefore, albeit secularized perhaps, it was the equivalent of the Beit Midrash. And then perhaps the most famous of all Hebrew authors, a man who won the Nobel Prize for Literature, Shmuel Agnon, died in 1970, refers to the cafe, the coffee house, as a lost home. So all of these are amazing phenomena. Now, it gives one the impression that coffee was always welcomed and so forth in Jewish life. Well, we know that as early as the 17th century, in the 1650s, despite the British penchant for tea, there was a coffee house opened in Oxford, apparently run by a Jewish man. We only have his first name, Jacob Yaakov. And when they talk about this particular coffee house in medieval England, they talk about this beverage, which is in Old English spelled Noveltie, a novelty. And we also know that in the early 18th and 17th centuries, there were coffee houses in the Jewish ghettos of Venice and Mantua in Italy. I'm not going to give a lecture on Italian Jewry. It should be given because this is one of the most important and richest Jewish communities in the history of our people. And the reason that coffee houses are established in Venice and in the city of Mantua, which not many of us are familiar with, is because these were great centers of Jewish culture and activity, most notably as a result of the establishment of publishing houses, which published Jewish books. And these Jewish books were published in Venice and in Mantua, and most notably in Mantua, the greatest volume of Jewish mysticism, the Zohar, the Book of Splendor. And therefore, it made perfect sense to have coffee houses there because it would attract all kinds of people. Now, the impression that I am giving you thus far is that coffee was always a very welcome beverage, both in the Jewish world and totally in the European world. Well, that is not exactly so, because if it were, I would be concluding my lecture now, and poor Rabbi Berkman would be stuck with having to fill the remainder of the hour. So I have to go back in time, and I want to go back in time first to Germany. I want to go back to Germany in the 18th century. Now, I could give a long lecture on the history of Germany, which I'm not going to do, other than to say that historically, it is one of the great Jewish communities in our history. And that's before the advent of Hitler and Nazism, because it is in Germany, among other things, where what we know as modern Orthodoxy, where what we know as Reform Judaism, where what we know as conservative Judaism all originate. That said, of all the European countries in the early 18th century and even earlier that were enjoying and benefiting from coffee that's coming in to England via London, or to France via Marseille, or to Holland via Amsterdam and other locales, is not coming in to Germany. And the reason it's not coming into Germany is because, unlike the other countries to which I have mentioned, Germany does not have colonies or places to get coffee in the Arab world, where coffee, or kawe, where the coffee bean originates, in places like Yemen and other parts of Arabia. And so initially, they are trying to avoid people drinking coffee. And for example, let me give the bishop of a place called Hildesheim in 1780, and I'm quoting, this is a religious individual, a Catholic bishop. I'm going to quote what he says. Men of Germany, your fathers drank spirits, hard liquor, and like Frederick the Great, were raised on beer and were happy and cheerful. No more money for coffee. All drinking vessels, particularly cups and ornamented little bowls, all mills, roasting machine, in short, everything to which the word coffee can be prefixed should be destroyed and smashed to bits, so that the memory of its destruction can be impressed upon our fellows. Well, that isn't working very well. Coffee is still getting in. And so finally, in certain, you have to also remember, we're not talking about a united country called Germany. That doesn't happen until Bismarck in 1871. We're talking about other smaller principalities, Hesse, Kassel, Saxony, where they said anybody, doesn't matter whether you're Jewish or Christian, anybody found drinking coffee is subject to a fine of 10 thalers, whatever that was worth, or 14 days in jail. Well, that's not working. Then, in certain parts of Germany, they say only high-ranking officers in the military will be permitted to drink coffee, and employers can prohibit workers from drinking coffee. Coffee vendors and coffee traders are subject to fines and property confiscation. That doesn't seem to work. So Frederick the Great, the Emperor of Prussia, where a lot of Jews live parenthetically, hires a group of what he calls coffee sniffers. And these are mainly discharged German soldiers from the Prussian army. They don't have a pension, so they can go around the streets of Berlin. And if they smell coffee brewing or somebody sneaking around, even drinking it, they can report these people, and there'll be a fine, and they can get 1/4 of the profit of the fine. Well, among the other opponents of coffee is a man named Christian Wilhelm Dohm, D-O-H-M, who holds a minor position in the Prussian government. And he says coffee, this Levantine drink, is a true political evil. And I wouldn't mention him except for one important reason. He is the author of a very famous document, which I'm not going to read to you, which he writes in German, which is called in English, Toward the Amelioration of the Civil Status of the Jews. He says, yes, Jews smell bad. Jews are unfortunate Asiatic refugees, but you would be too if you were persecuted, if you weren't allowed to become free citizens of a country. So look, okay, we can't make coffee. So instead of trying to produce coffee, and instead of suffering the economic consequences of being deprived of this beverage, instead, why don't we give the Jews who live here equal rights, equal citizenship? They can become productive citizens of the country, and as such, because of the work that they do, they're smart and all of that, we can compensate for all of the losses that we are incurring because of our inability to produce coffee, because we don't have the colonies that the British and the French and the Dutch have. Well, he's partially successful. I'm not going to go into it because that would take us astray, but he is partially successful, and Jews begin to enjoy any number of civic rights, particularly in places like Prussia, in places in Berlin, and also at the same time, coffee houses begin to thrive in Germany. Let me give you a description of two coffee houses in Germany. One in Hamburg. Hamburg is the place where many Jews go, Jews particularly who, after having to leave Spain in the 15th century, 1492, go to Hamburg. It's Protestant. It welcomes Jews. And here's a coffee house called Dreyer's Coffee House. They have billiard tables and several rooms where they play a variety games. There is a croupier who keeps track of bets and payments. There are wax lights, silver candlesticks. It's from the remarks of an English traveler. And then there's one in Leipzig. It does not lack anything to please its guests. One finds quite proper entertainment in the company of civilized students, well-behaved merchants. And that, believe it or not, is from a Leipzig travel guide. They had travel guides in 1792. Now I want to talk about Frankfurt. I want to talk about Frankfurt for a variety of reasons. In the modern era, Frankfurt was a great center of Jewish learning. The Frankfurt Lehrerhaus, which featured people like Franz Rosenzweig, Martin Buber, Gershom Scholem, Erich Fromm, and so forth. But also, Frankfurt was a place where Jews prospered for nearly 300 years. And there were what they call in Frankfurt Garkuchen. These were eateries, restaurants, and places you could sleep in private Jewish homes in a street called the Judegasse. Now, those of you who might have gone to Havana, Cuba during the Obama administration, the only reason I'm getting political at all is because you will remember that during the Obama administration, Cuba opened up and there were tours to Cuba. There were Jewish tours to Cuba. My wife and I were among those who went to Cuba on a Jewish tour. And what the Cuban government did, despite being a socialist economy, was to allow certain private residences to have restaurants in a very capitalistic way. They had to pay the government a substantial amount of money, but you could go and eat in one of those restaurants. Well, in Frankfurt, when Frankfurt held a fair where people from all over Europe came to the fair, including Jews from a variety of places, in the Judegasse, there were Garkuchen, eateries and lodgings in these private homes where food was served, coffee was given and served, and so forth. But I want to share one incident, which is a very interesting incident, may surprise you. During one of the fairs, a group of Frankfurt Jews are sitting at a table having a nice meal and schmoozing with one another, drinking coffee, when a stranger, another Jew who has come to the fair without being invited, sits down at the table. And they don't want to be very hospitable to this guy. So they say, "What are you doing here? We don't want you to stay here." They say, "Get out of the table, go sit someplace else." They did it all in German, obviously. He is insulted. So what does he do? And I'm not exaggerating. He takes his handkerchief. He blows his nose into his handkerchief and he throws it into the bowl of sauerkraut on the table. Well, as you can imagine, a riot breaks out, and this is all involving Jews. The riot breaks out. When the riot is done, 2 Jews are dead and 1 Jew is seriously injured. As a consequence of that, henceforth, the government of Frankfurt orders that no one can enter a Garkuchen unless they show appropriate credentials in advance. There will not be any ladies of the night who will lodge in any of the rooms, and everyone must show that they have the proper authority and permission to do so. So I just wanted to share that with you. Now, when coffee becomes as popular as it becomes, the rabbis have a serious problem. Now, I grant you, if Rabbi Berkman today were to go to the board of trustees of and she's a coffee fan, she told me, of Congregation Ohabei Shalom, and say, "Ladies and gentlemen, I've decided that we should not serve coffee from a Jewish perspective." I think she might be looking for another job shortly thereafter. So you've got to go back in time with me several hundred years. The rabbis are very unhappy about the coffee connection and about Jewish involvement in all manner of coffee consumption, trade, etc. Why? Well, look, the coffee house itself is what they call in Hebrew Moshav Leitzim. I think the best English translation, lazy people with nothing better to do are going to spend their time there. Not only that, they're going to be attracted not to religious things, but to secular attractions. And that is not good for the Jewish people. Second, the coffee house could be a place of potential licentious behavior. What if you go to one of these coffee houses and you meet a woman? Even if it's a Jewish woman, this has not been a prearranged marriage, but God forbid you might meet a non-Jewish woman. And who knows what the ultimate consequences of that is going to happen. Not only that, the coffee house isn't kosher. How do we know what's being served there? How do we know what kinds of dishes they're using? You can't do it. Moreover, the coffee house is a secular replacement of the study house. Remember, a little while ago, I talked to you about the praise of a group of Israeli novelists and poets about the coffee house in the 20th century in in Palestine, where they compared it to a temple, where they compared it. But this is 200-300 years earlier. This is awful. This is awful. And then in the late 18th, early 19th century, the great Moses Mendelssohn, who literally, he and many of his followers were responsible for the liberalization of Judaism, etc., horrifies the rabbinate. What does he do? He visits a coffee house in Berlin called the Gelehrtes Coffee House, the learned coffee house, where what people are doing is precisely what the rabbis were terrified of them doing, despite his knowledge, despite his learning, etc. They engage in non-religious discussions. For example, Mendelssohn, gives a lecture called On Probability. On another occasion, another intellectual gets up, not Jewish, because there were billiard tables where you could play pool, and gives a lecture on the motion of two billiard balls on a horizontal plane. The rabbis are horrified. Let me move a little later into Jewish history. I'm not going to give a story, the history of Zionism. However, during the late 19th century, both Theodor Herzl, the founder of political Zionism, in novels that he writes, and his most trusted deputy, his most trusted colleague, a man named Max Nordau, write lengthy descriptions of coffee houses as symbols of Jewish male effeminacy. Jews, men who sit and talk in coffee houses are degenerates. They are pale, bookish, and Jewish. And what we need, says Nordau in particular, are Muskeljuden, muscle Jews, macho men. We're not going to be Zionists. We're not going to make our way back to Palestine if you sit in these coffee houses and all you do is drink coffee and engage in all kinds of intellectual discussions, however profound you think they might be. Now, it's fascinating that Nordau, who was pushing Muskeljuden, in 1900, and by the way, before I forget, you may remember that just about a month or so ago, there was a celebration in Basel, Switzerland, of the 125th anniversary of the first Zionist Congress, which was held in Basel in 1897, where both Herzl and Nordau spoke. In 1903, Nordau goes to a Jewish gymnastic club in Berlin. Berlin, parenthetically, was the last city in Germany to allow coffee and to allow coffee houses. And he speaks before a Jewish gymnastic club called the Bar Kokhba Club. Remember Bar Kokhba, the hero of the rebellion against Rome. The rebellion fails, but Bar Kokhba becomes a symbol of Jewish power. And I want to quote what he says. Let us once more become deep-chested, tightly muscled, courageous men. Our new Muskel Jews have not as yet matched the heroism of our forefathers, who in large numbers streamed to the gymnasia to take part in competitions and pitted themselves against well-trained Hellenistic athletes and the powerful Nordic barbarians. He reminds me, some of you may have read Arthur Koestler, who wrote a novel called The Promise and the Fulfillment, and he talks about these new Israeli Jews, young Hebrew Tarzans. Herzl, Nordau want young Hebrew Tarzans, not yeshiva buchers and not Jews who sit in coffee shops in various parts, not only of Germany, but anywhere else in Europe. Well, that notwithstanding, it's not going to be successful. So rabbis have to grin and bear it. So they have to come up with ways of dealing with the reality of Jews partaking of coffee. So first of all, they have to decide, is coffee what they call bishulei nochrim, a non-Jewish drink? And they say, no, I guess it really isn't a non-Jewish drink. And some of the rabbis tasted, hey, it tastes pretty good. So they decide, no, it's okay to drink. However, in the German city of Fürth in 1728, the rabbis decree that you can't drink coffee or tea for that matter, or even smoke unless you have done a couple of things. You've got to recite the motzi before you eat at all. And when the meal is over, you've got to chant Birkat HaMazon. And only after you have done both of those can you drink your coffee or smoke. Well, how many Jews observe that? That's a whole other story. I have no idea, and they didn't have any idea. But then you got another issue. Shouldn't there be a blessing that is recited before the drinking of coffee? After all, motzi lechem min ha'aretz, when you eat bread, borei pri ha'etz, when you say orange juice, and so forth. And there's a big debate. And it boils down to one of two alternatives. Either borei pri ha'adama, the fruit of the earth, or you eat a potato, you can say that, and other things. Or is it going to be shehakol nihiyeh bidvaro? We bless God who is responsible by virtue of his word. Hakol nihiyeh, things come about. And so they decide that because the coffee bean, even though it's a bean, the coffee bean is a coffee plant, the desirable bracha, the desirable blessing is shehakol nihiyeh bidvaro. Now we got another problem. Okay, we've got these blessings. What about Shabbat? What about preparing coffee on Shabbat? And they already know that Jews, I'm not going to ask anybody here if you go to Starbucks on Shabbat. That's between you and your conscience or whatever. But in those days, we know from the material that we've gleaned that Jews would walk into a Christian coffee house on Shabbat, and they would say, and the proprietors already knew that the Jew was coming in. They probably even paid him the day before, and they would simply ask, is the coffee ready? And so they would get the coffee that way. Or there is a consultation of rabbis living in the Muslim world, in Egypt in particular, where there are big Jewish coffee drinkers. And apparently, they learned that what Egyptian Jews would do on a Friday before Shabbat would be to take coffee beans and grind them into a powder on Friday. Some of them would actually eat that sounds terrible, but better. On Friday, they would pour hot water on the beans. And they come up with a crazy Talmudic principle. Once you've heated the beans and they're already heated, you could pour hot water on them again, even on Shabbat, and drinking them. Where'd you get the hot water? Well, I grew up in a very Orthodox home. And those of you who may have also grown up on a very Orthodox home may know that before Shabbat, you could have one burner, away or hot coals or something, and you could reheat on that using that. And that's what they did. But what about Pesach? Isn't it ironic today? Maxwell House coffee, good to the last drop, still has a Haggadah. People use it. Okay. What are you going to do? And there's a big rabbinic debate. Are coffee beans legumes? You can't eat legumes on Pesach. Well, there's a big debate. And while any number of rabbis say no, the majority say it's okay as long as you know for sure that the beans were ground before Pesach by someone who is Jewish. And of course, the prepper, and it was done, cleaning the grinding, but it's got to be done by someone who is Jewish. Now, obviously, especially in Germany, but other places, the fact that Jews are engaged in the coffee trade is going to be a sore point for many Christian merchants who are also engaged in the coffee trade. And so they come up with all kinds of accusations. Jews are subversives. They're a state within a state. They really are not true citizens of our country. Jews are immoral. They are so immoral that in earlier centuries, Christians had no choice but to kill them. The Jewish coffee trader poses a threat to the health and welfare of Christian citizens, since Jews are known for poisoning the food and water supply. Jews, why do you open your door on Pesach? Well, there are all kinds of reasons, but among them, yes, it's to allow Elijah to enter, but during the medieval world, when Passover would coincide with Easter, Jews would open their homes to show non-Jewish passersby that there was no voodoo, there was no magic, we're not drinking the blood of matzah made with the blood of Christians and so forth, and so forth, and so on. Well, I want to go now, time permitting, to the use of coffee for rabbinic rulings, and also to the use of where coffee becomes a very important ritual that enhances Jewish belief and observance, among some of the other reasons that I chose to talk about the coffee. Let me give you two fascinating rabbinic rulings where coffee became an important evidentiary proof text. One takes place in a town in Italy in 1754, where two men, two Jews, claim to both be engaged to the same woman. And the rabbi of the town has to make the ruling. His name is David Fardo. Here's what happens. For some reason, on a Shabbat morning, while the Torah is being read, the groom, the potential groom, somehow finds his girlfriend. Maybe she was outside, maybe she was upstairs behind the mechitza, but neither he nor she were paying attention to the Torah reading. That's not so strange, is it? Anyway, he puts a ring on her finger, and people around and says to her, I betroth you. I betroth you. And there are other people who say, Mazel tov, Mazel tov. Later, during the Musaf service, for some reason, and the ring is lost. It's found later, but the ring is lost, and she doesn't have a ring on her finger. And another guy comes up to her and puts a ring on her finger and says, marry me, I'm betrothing you. So what's going to happen? There's a big argument. How are we going to prove who is the right groom? Because both of these boys are claiming that they are the potential groom. Well, there is an Oneg Shabbat, and the rabbi is there. And the father of the bride, who witnessed everything that had happened, refers to the first groom, the first potent, and said, look, I testify that he is the legitimate groom, besides which I am paying for the oneg. I am paying for the cake and the coffee here. And the rabbi rules that because the father testified that he paid for the coffee and the cake, that he is a reliable witness, and the first potential groom is the richtige groom for the bride. But even a more important one, the case of what we call the adulterous son-in-law in Prague in 1770. And this is the ruling of the great rabbi of Prague, Ezekiel Landau. There is a young Jewish boy who is the tutor to a young girl in a Prague Jewish home. For 3 years, he's tutoring her. What nobody seems to know is that during the 3 years, he is having an affair with the girl's mother. He marries the girl in a nice Jewish ceremony, but he feels very guilty. So he goes to the rabbi and he says, Rabbi, I have to confess, I love my bride, but I was also having this illicit relationship with the woman who is now my shviger, my mother-in-law. So you know what the rabbi rules? That the boy must go and tell his father-in-law, his shver, what he had done and seek forgiveness. The parents must separate, since the father-in-law, according to Jewish law, is forbidden to have any sexual relations with his adulterous wife. But since he's an elderly man, he's so naive, the rabbi, it wouldn't matter. Now, for the boy, he has to fast several days a week for 3 years. No alcohol. He must abstain from games like cards and dice. He certainly dare not look at other women, but he is permitted to drink, you guessed it, coffee and tea alone. The fact that he was studying Torah is also a bit of a redeeming factor to make the punishment a little more lenient. But I want to deal with a couple of far more religious aspects of what coffee did in the medieval world. And even today, in some respects. You know, according to Jewish law, one may not engage in morning prayer. Whether it's at home, you want to put your tefillin on, you got up in the morning, you said, and so forth. And certainly you may not go to the synagogue for the morning service before, you must do that before you eat. Now, if you're at home, that's not so bad. But if you're going to go to a service, whether it's a shacharit service during the week or on Shabbat, and not to eat, and so the rabbis decree that you may drink coffee, and that is acceptable before you engage in prayer, and coffee will keep you awake, which makes it even better. And we know also in the medieval world that in some places where a synagogue was being rented, it wasn't owned, and the people didn't have the financial means to pay the rent, they paid the rent sometimes partially in coffee beans, and that was acceptable. But even more important, what in Germany and in Italy and perhaps in other parts of Europe in the medieval world became what was called the Wachnat in German, in Hebrew, Mishmarot, in Italian, Vigilia, both on the eve of when a child was circumcised, but even more significantly, before a baby was born, to prevent Lilith from snatching, kidnapping infants. And there's a long story about Lilith, which I have to share with you because it's very important. And we have to go back to Adam. And I can't give a lecture on Adam, but I must tell you this. Adam plays multiple roles in Jewish tradition, some of which are very positive. Case in point, according to Jewish tradition in the Talmud, Adam was supposed to live 1,000 years. And God shows Adam all the generations that will come after him. And he says, you know, there was one person in particular named David, but David's going to die in childbirth. He would have been a great king in Israel. From him would come the ultimate Messiah of the Jewish people. And Adam says, really? I'll tell you what, Eternal One, give him 70 of my years so that he can wax and grow. And so Adam does that and so forth. However, the story of Lilith is slightly different. Adam is lonely. He needs a mate. According to the Talmud, Adam tried to have relationship with animals. It didn't work. And so instead, lo and behold, someone named Lilith appears. And Lilith seems to be okay, except there is a real sexual problem. And if you'll forgive me, I have to share it with you. According to Ben Sira, who writes about this, Lilith wants to be on top. And Adam will not allow this to take place. Lilith is banished. And so because of her banishment, henceforth, she will kidnap Jewish babies. And so a tradition called the Vachnat, Mishmarot, and you have to sit up all night with in the birthing room to make sure that Lilith will not return. And there are all kinds of ways of doing this. There are special amulets, magic charms that you use. There are also, but it's an all-night thing. There are also, it's interesting as well that we know that women in certain parts of your Jewish women, in warding off Lilith, sometimes would appeal to Mary, because Christian women pray to Mary for safe, healthy births, and Jewish women would too. And we read, among other things, that there were non-Jewish women who, when they prayed to Mary, would say the following, and I'm quoting, "Mary, do not banish me from your presence. I am not like those Jewish women who invoke the Virgin's aid and in giving birth, and then go through their homes with white napkins shouting, 'Mary, be gone, be gone.'" But instead, there were Yiddish blessings that were uttered protections against Lilith. And there are books called Seder Bakashot Utchinot in Yiddish. My grandmother of blessed memory had a Techina book, and she would read from it often. And here is one example where people would pray, "May it be your will, O God and God of our ancestors, that you should give me strength all the days of my pregnancy, that neither my strength or the strength of my fetus should weaken in any respect." Or she would pray, "Michael, Raphael, Gabriel, three principal angels, I pray that you stand before the Holy One and bring my request that I will be privileged to bear pious children. Let my prayer come before you as the sacrifices, for we have no temple or sacrifices or high priest. I pray also, Metatron was another chief angel, chief of staff, that you should ask the Holy One that I should give birth to a Torah scholar. So pray for me and bring me the good news." And then, believe it or not only to ward off Lilith, but to do the following in some birthing rooms. In the medieval world, one would take an open scroll of the Torah. It would not only prevent Lilith from entering, but that, as well as in other places, if you lived close by, and in small Jewish towns this was possible, you would take a strong rope and you would go to the neighboring synagogue and you would tie the rope to the ark where the Torah was stored, and the rope would extend all the way to the birthing room of the home. And in the course of a woman's labor, the woman would pull on the rope, which would open to expose the Torah. And this was symbolic of opening her womb for a simple and painless, safe delivery. And all of this would be done with a gathering in the home, and where coffee would be drunk. Coffee would become sacralized. Coffee would be drunk in order to keep people awake so that they could be present when the birth was about to happen, in addition to the prayers and the amulets, etc. And even more telling, in Sfat, the great city, the source of mystic Judaism. Some of you have been there, I know, and where you were shown the tombs of some of the great mystics. There was a ceremony in the medieval world called Tikkun Leil Shvuot, a way of correcting the universe, part of a sacred ritual. One of the tikkuns that we do, you do it at Ohabei Shalom, is Tikkun Leil Shvuot, and in other synagogues where one usually doesn't spend the entire night. You're supposed to, but you spend a good bit of the evening, in the course of which you serve refreshments. And I will bet anything that among the beverages that are served, you serve coffee. Coffee, because if you spend the entire night in study and in prayer, coffee will keep you awake. And so here again, coffee became sacred. Well, the midnight ritual of Tikkun Chatzot was a way of the mending of the cosmos. And in the 16th century, in Sfat, one of the rabbis would walk through the town and would say, awake, awake, kumu, uru la'avodat haborei, awake in honor of the temple. The temple has been burnt. We must sing, we must pray, we must study. And so we read that in order to keep people motivated, in order to continue the study with everyone's heart and energy, coffee became the beverage that was served. And so in all of these methodologies, I would suggest to you that coffee changed the course of Jewish history. We really don't recognize how much coffee was instrumental in what it did, but I would cite one final quote, one from the author of a recent book, a part of a bibliography that I used in sharing this with you, a book which he called, fittingly enough, A Rich Brew. His name is Shachar Pinsker. He's a professor of Hebrew literature at the University of Michigan, and this is what he writes. The cafe has been an essential facet of the modern Jewish experience, has been critical to its complex mixture of history and fiction, of reality, of imagination, of longing and belonging, of consumption, of sociability, of idleness, and of productivity. And I would suggest that all of this is summed up beautifully by him. So the next time, my friends, that you go to a coffee house, whether it be the one that we talked about mainly tonight or any of the others, you will be mindful of the significance of coffee and its role in the evolution of our people. Thank you very much.
Wow, Rabbi Seltzer, that was amazing. I did not expect to learn as much as I did, but I should have known. I was warned that you would be quite a font of knowledge. And that is, as I told you earlier, two of my favorite topics rolled into one. And I learned so much, and I am sure we all did. Thank you so much for this. And I'm so glad we have it recorded, because I know there were some folks who wanted to hear your talk and couldn't be with us. And there was so much to it. Maybe some of us want to go back and listen again. But I do want to open it up just for a few questions. We can have a brief Q&A if anyone has any questions. I will look at the screen. We've got a couple of screens full. You can raise your hand or raise your virtual hand if you know how to do that. And the only thing is, you're all muted, and once I call on you, our tech guru, Josh, behind the scenes will need to allow you to unmute. So it might just take a moment. But Yasher Koach, Rabbi
Thank
Seltzer,
you.
and thank you
Thank
so
you.
much.
Thank you, Susan.
Okay, any questions?
Well, I see a hand.
Yes, Esta. So just
Esther
give us
from
a moment so we can give you permission to
Esther
unmute.
from Saddlebrook,
From Tucson,
suburb of
Arizona.
Tucson.
From Tucson, Arizona.
Welcome.
I am just completely overwhelmed with the people were so superstitious, so, I don't know, you can't say they were ignorant because they didn't know anything better. But it just seems, I just never realized that
Well,
could believe these things would
well,
happen.
you know, you call it superstition. I could go in, how many of us today, we're so sophisticated, some of the nonsense we believe. I don't want to go political tonight.
That's
Some of the nonsense you read on Zoom, on Twitter or on Facebook, and people believe it. And I don't know how many people even today walk around with a rabbit's foot in their pocket. I don't know how many people, how many of us are going to walk under a ladder, are going to cover our beds. So I'm not sure that we can be quite that aghast, Esther. It's an interesting question as to what our forebears did.
And all of this has been recorded by what? Passing down of.
It's recorded in a variety of books and materials, yes. It's an extensive bibliography. You got to go to multiple places.
I can't imagine what, Rabbi, you're going to talk about if we go into sugar.
Well, sugar was another component. I'm not going to go to sugar.
Next time.
Sugar, yeah.
I see Eileen's hand. Go ahead. We'll just give us a moment.
Eileen, also from Tucson. Go ahead, Eileen.
We're just giving her permission to unmute. Just one moment. There you go. Oops. One more time. Okay. Now I think you can unmute, Eileen.
She's still muted.
Yeah, we're working on it. Okay.
There you go. No.
Oh, it keeps going in and out. Josh, is there a way to fix that? There you go. Okay.
Okay. Hi, Rabbi.
Hi.
I really enjoyed your talk, and I was wondering, now if you want to get coffee, you can get different kinds from different countries. At that time, do we know if there were specific kinds of coffee that were used for specific kinds of things, like coffee for staying up at night, a coffee for something in your home, a coffee, for this and that? Was it all generic, or did they have to have different types for different occasions?
That's a very good question, and I honestly don't know the answer. I don't think we had various brands like we have today, and they didn't have decaf. That came much later. Coffee did come from a variety of Arab countries, and so certainly the coffee beans themselves, depending upon where they were grown, the flavors obviously would have been somewhat differently. Their strength, etc., would certainly have differed. So certainly from that perspective, there would have been a diversified coffee selection.
Okay, thank you.
Let's see. I see Ellen. Go ahead. Josh, that we want to unmute under the name Howard Core.
Unmute. Okay, it worked.
Yep.
Rabbi, I just want to say hi. It's been so long. I really
Yeah, it's been so long. It's
you.
lovely to see you. Hi.
Yeah, I'll be very quick. Your lecture tonight made me wish I liked coffee.
Well, you can always start.
Oh, yes, Howard's right here. He wants to ask something.
Hi, Howard.
My proxy. What made you give the idea to put this all together? What was the
I
impetus for that?
couldn't hear him.
He wonders what was the impetus for putting all this information together for this
The
subject.
pattern and the theme.
Well, I like to deal in subjects that nobody else seems to be interested in. Let me put it that way. I started reading about it and I said, this is not unimportant. Coffee did play a significant role in the history of the Jewish people. And I think it's important, since it's such a common thing, that people become aware of its significance then and now, and not merely take it for granted. So that was the real motivation for what prompted me to do this.
Thank you.
Great.
You're welcome.
Great. Maybe we have time for probably one more question. Anyone? Yes, go ahead. I see Robbie, and I'm so sorry that I forgot your name, but go ahead and unmute Robbie Solomon, please, Josh. Thank you.
Oh, Robbie.
Hi,
Hi,
Sam.
Robbie and Helen.
Hi,
Sam,
Ellen.
I have a question. Ethiopia claims to have they were the first to ever discover and use coffee. And I know they're just over the sea to Yemen, but they're the ones who claim to have invented or discovered coffee as a drinking thing. They also claim to have the Ark of the Covenant there.
Yeah.
And
I'm going to respond.
I know that was way back before European and your history.
Yeah, I'll respond. But first, I'm glad I want to say a word. When I began, I talked about memories of my rabbinate at Ohabei Shalom. My dear friend, we shared the pulpit.
Sure.
Sweet singer in Israel, cantor Rabbi Solomon, and I want to mention the late Alex Zimmer as well, his predecessor. But Rabbi and I, some of you may remember, and so I wanted to add that. And I shouldn't do a commercial, but I'm going to do it. And I know that Rabbi Berkman knows this. In January, the Solomons are going to be celebrating the bar mitzvah of one of their grandchildren. And it's going to be my privilege, along with a cantor Solomon, I think, to help conduct that Shabbat morning service. So anyway, Helen. And Helen, didn't you go to Ethiopia?
A couple times.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Ethiopia certainly can compete with Yemen as another source of that early coffee, which found its way ultimately into Europe. So that's certainly a reality. I think the search for the covenant, the whole era, is what we call in French a Baba-Maisa. There is no real legitimate evidence of that reality, but it's a little bit, if you will, comparable, with all due respect, to Haile Selassie calling himself the Lion of Judah. But so thank you for that, and it's great to see you.
Good to see you. We'll see you soon.
Absolutely.
Well,
Hello to Rita. I know she's there.
She's there.
thank you again. And I want to say, you reminded me in mentioning Robbie and seeing Robbie here and Helen. In December, Robbie will be joining others, including cantor Randy Schloss and myself and our current assistant rabbi, Jen Queen, and David Spar, and other musicians of TOS on December 3rd for a beautiful concert that will be the culmination of a lot of celebration of our 180th year.
That's wonderful.
And that will also be available for those of you not in town. That will be available to live stream as well. So please be in touch with us or check our website for details on that. And I want to just reiterate that this was just a beautiful preface to our weekend of learning that's coming up Friday night and Saturday. On Shabbat, we'll have a variety of learning opportunities, and this was a really wonderful way. We're sorry you can't be with us this weekend, Rabbi Seltzer, but this was really, we thank you so much for providing this learning opportunity. And I want to reiterate that wherever any of you are in the country, our events this weekend will also be available via Zoom. So you can check our website or be in touch with the temple office to get that information if you'd like. You can see our schedule on the website, but I can't thank you enough. This was wonderful, and looking forward to having coffee with you when you're next in town. And now knowing so much more about my favorite beverage.
Okay.
Thank you all for joining us. We really are delighted to see these full Zoom screens, and thank you for being with us, and be well, everyone. Have a good
And
night.
I would say thank you to all. Lehitraot until we meet again. Bye-bye. Good night.
Thank
Sandy,
you.
I just wanted to say hi. It's Sherry.
Oh, Sherry, yes, I was looking for you, Sherry.
I know, I'm sorry. I was having some technical issues. This was so
Okay,
wonderful.
but it's
Thank
great
you
to
so
see
much.
you. Oh,
great
there
to see
you
you
are,
too.
Sherry. It's delightful to see you. We go back and give my love to Mike as well. Will you
I definitely
please?
will.
Please.
You and Rita haven't changed a bit.
Well, I don't know about that. She hasn't. She hasn't. I'm a little older, you know.
It's great to see you. I'll see you in January.
Great to see you. Okay,
Take
care.
Rabbi. Well
Bye.
done.
Thank you
Well
so
done.
Good
much.
night, everybody.
Thank you.
Good night.
Okay.